Hi. Play Plus from Polyend is the next generation of their innovative original Play Groovebox. It looks the same, but inside are 8 new additional synth voices, with support for 3 different timbres simultaneously, new stereo sample support for the existing 8 sample voices, and multi-channel USB audio. In this video, I'll take a detailed look at what's new in Play Plus compared to Play, an in-depth look at its new synth engines and workflow, and pros and cons compared to the competition. I'll also look at a few new interesting features added to both Play and now Play Plus in firmware updates since my first comprehensive video. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Polyend sent Play Plus over for review. No money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with the differences between Play Plus and the original Play. The first major thing that's new in Play Plus is the 8 new synth voices, which you can use across up to 3 different timbres. So for example, one timbre is programmed here, another timbre here, and another timbre here. These all work simultaneously alongside the original 8 sample-based voices. These 3 timbres or slots can each access one of 4 different synth engines. So you can see the 3 slots here, and each of them can access one of 4 different models: ACD, FAT, VAP, and WTFM. This one is based on simple 2-operator FM synthesis, and the other 3 are different virtual analog subtractive synthesis-based engines, from simple basic ones to pretty complex ones. Each of these, by the way, can be either monophonic or polyphonic, with up to 8 voice polyphony based on how you want to distribute the voices between the 3 different synth slots. So for example, in this project, most of the voices have been allocated to slot 3. So you've got a total of 8 synth-based voices on top of the 8 sample-based voices like in the original Play. The second thing that's new is stereo sample support for the 8 sample-based voices. That said, Play Plus has the same internal memory as the original Play, so that's 6 minutes of mono samples or down to 3 minutes of stereo samples. Disk streaming of samples is currently not supported. Then the third major thing that's new is on the connectivity side. There's no difference in terms of physical ports or I/O, but the USB-C port can now send multi-channel audio over USB. It actually has 28 USB outputs. The main output, a stereo pair for each of the 8 sample tracks, then 3 stereo channels for each of the synth timbres, and 2 additional channels for the reverb and delay effects. So those are the big differences. One of the striking things you'll notice if you look at them side by side is that other than the little plus silk screen here, the 2 look exactly the same. They've got the same black and white high-resolution OLED screen, the same capacitive touch encoders, the same buttons to the left and to the right, and the same 20x8 RGB non-velocity sensitive grid of pads. The workflow, generative, and performance features are also exactly the same as far as the 8 sample-based tracks go, but at least as of the current firmware, a lot of the generative and performance features don't extend to the synth or MIDI tracks. More on what does and doesn't apply to the synth and MIDI tracks a bit later. What they've done is add the new internal synth functionality to Play's MIDI mode. So as before, you use shift and patterns to toggle between audio and MIDI or between the sample mode and the MIDI mode, but the MIDI mode is now also shared with the synth controls. Now, despite quite a bit of added synth functionality in Play Plus, the labels on the panel are exactly the same as the original Play, so you'll need to gradually learn by heart which synth functionality is where when you swap between the audio or synth and MIDI modes. The different functionality, by the way, doesn't apply to all the encoders, just to the 8 over here. And luckily, most of the synth-specific functions are somewhat related to the sample-oriented labels on the panel. On the connectivity side, I already mentioned, things are the same physically. Both are powered over USB-C. Both have a TRS MIDI input and output and a 3.5mm stereo output, and they come with a single 5-pin MIDI adapter or dongle and a stereo splitter with 1/4-inch inputs. One interesting thing Polyend has decided to do regarding people who already bought Play is to offer an upgrade path from Play to Play Plus. It's a hardware upgrade, so you'll need to send in your unit, and they're not discontinuing the original Play, they're actually discounting it quite substantially, which I think makes it extremely compelling. I'll add price check affiliate links in the description of this video. One last thing before I dive into the new synths on Play Plus in detail. Play's workflow, fill, randomization, chance, and performance features, all of what makes it special as far as samples are concerned, are things that I already covered in my review of the original Play. And that took about 50 minutes. I rewatched it and it holds up quite nicely, except for a few new features that were added in firmware updates. I'll cover those later. So rather than repeat everything, if you're not familiar with Play's basics, I'll link to that video below. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at the synths. I'll start a new project. Like I mentioned, you toggle between the green sample mode and the purple MIDI and synth mode using shift and patterns. If you program in sample-based steps, they're white, and if you program in synth-based steps, they'll be in one of 3 different colors based on the synth you choose. Purple for synth 1, and yellow for synth 2, then green for synth 3. MIDI notes, by the way, share the same grid, and they'll be in white. And while you can drop any MIDI or synth note anywhere you want, it's better not to make a mess of things like I did here and to use the different tracks for different synth or MIDI controls so that it's easier to later on select and change them separately. Let's clear this out to keep things clean. Once you've selected one of the synth slots, you can obviously play and preview it. You've got quick access to the different presets for the engine chosen for that synth slot. And there are quite a few to choose from. And like I mentioned, you can choose a different synth engine for each synth slot. So for example, if I wanted to use the acid engine, the ACD engine here, just go into synths, go into slot 1 and choose a different engine. I think there's a little bug here, but I actually am in the ACD engine. I could choose its presets. Here we go. So we're in ACD in this preset, and this is what is applied to synth slot 1. You can choose the same engine in each slot if you like, or go ahead to a different slot and choose a different engine for that slot. If you like, by the way, you can also choose an init patch for that synth. And other general controls you have are polyphony for that slot, gain, and panning. I found that you do need to be mindful of setting gain. If you're playing a synth monophonically, you can set it pretty loud. But if you want to play polyphonically, you'll want to watch your headroom. Anyway, once you init a patch, or if you select one of the presets, there are 2 ways that you can control it. Either by editing the patch in the patch editor, which has a long list of parameters. You can edit a parameter, by the way, either by pressing it and editing it, or by scrolling up and down the list and using the tempo encoder. And then the second way is using the 3 macro knobs, this one, and this one, each giving you access to 2 parameters. Typically, this will let you control the filter cutoff, and the secondary parameter will let you control resonance. And if you don't like this double tap to select a parameter functionality, then you can disable it. I found it sometimes to work and sometimes not here. Anyway, you can edit parameters either using these 2 selection buttons in the screen encoder, or by tapping and double tapping the touch encoders. And a quick workflow reminder, you can also reset parameters with a double tap. Anyway, so 2 macro controls here, 2 macro controls in this knob, typically controlling attack and decay release. Though you or whoever programs the patch can change these parameters to control any other parameters in the patch. So not necessarily just the filter or attack and decay. And then the third pair of macros are controlled with this knob. And again, you can relabel these to anything you want. Here it's the filter envelope and the oscillator. Whoops, the oscillator. You can see the knobs are a bit touchy here. I don't know if it's just my pre-production unit or maybe this needs a firmware update. And by the way, if you're not happy with this double tap behavior, you can always disable it and just select parameters with these buttons. Anyway, these are the 6 parameters controlled by these 3 encoders. They can be renamed to anything the patch designer wants, by the way. So I could go into here and to edit the patch and then scroll all the way down to the encoders and rename this one to whatever I want. So if it's teeny orange, next time that I press this encoder, that's all I get. Beside these 6 parameters, velocity is actually another macro. So that too can be defined and renamed by whoever creates the patch. And I'm not sure if they're going to keep it or not, but in this beta, there's actually an 8th macro, which is controlled by pressure or aftertouch if you use an external keyboard. In case you're wondering, at least as of the current firmware, there are no overdrive and bit depth functions for the synth engines. These are related to the sample-based engines. So all that, the macros velocity is one way to control patches, and there's fairly little menu diving involved in that. But if you want to go beyond the factory presets or just tweak them or create your own, then you're going to want to familiarize yourself with the patch editor. Each of the 4 synth engines have different parameters, different patch parameters. The acid or ACD and fat synths are relatively simple. A few oscillator parameters, filter parameters, envelopes and modulation, and portamento controls. And this is where you edit which parameters each of the macro knobs control. So say, for example, if I wanted to edit my teeny orange macro, you go into that, you've got 5 parameters that each macro can control, and you can select quite a few of the patch parameters as macro knob destinations. And like I mentioned, the filter cutoff macro doesn't necessarily need to be neither called filter macro or control the filter cutoff. It can also control any one of the controllable parameters here. Let's say sub mode. So if I now exit out, back, and you need to make sure not to press live record here. Anyway, this macro now controls absorb twist. So let's dive into the synths and see what's special about each. I'll start with the acid synth, and let's select an init patch. One of the things I noticed is that when you do select an init patch, then the filter cutoff is actually pretty closed. So you might want to open it up and maybe reduce resonance if you want, and turn off the envelope. Anyway, the default settings aren't necessarily the plain vanilla ones you'll see on other synths. Also, notes aren't sustained by default. So let's open that up, and we're now ready to listen to the oscillators. So I think the raw tone here is pretty good. So you've got for ACD, saw, and square, and a sub oscillator. Sounds pretty nice to me. Noise controls, coarse pulse width. So I won't go through all these parameters, but I think you get the idea. There's a few simple mod depth controls and even pulse width modulation. And then you've got a filter. Resonance. Really nice, I think. Then there are a few filter types for the different synths, some more than others. So, yeah, quite menu divey for sure, but I think sounds pretty good. Anyway, that is more or less the acid synth. You've got control over the LFO here, and portamento controls, which you'll obviously want for acid style synth, and the macros. So that's ACD pretty much. Let's maybe go through a few patches just to take a listen to them. So I think you get the general idea. Quite a lot to choose from. Each of these, by the way, has their own macro controls. So let's say if we get out of here, so each patch can have up to 6 macros and the 7th if you count velocity. That is pretty much the acid synth. Let's move on to the second model, the fat model. Again, you can see that the default parameters are, for some reason, a closed filter with resonance. Let's take that down and add sustain. So fat is, as the name implies, is designed to make unison style sounds with multiple oscillators where you've got control over the detune. Brightness isn't a filter, it's a mix between an oscillator an octave above and below. Then there's timbre, which is the wave shape of the oscillators. So again, I think a respectable sound. Here too, you've got filter with resonance and a few filter types. So these are the options here. And in terms of modulation, this one is relatively simple too. Let's take a listen to a few of the factory presets. I'll start skipping a few. Nice stuff, I think. Pretty nice, and this is obviously before I started playing with the macros, so there's a bit more range in here. So that was the Fat Synth Engine. Let's move on and choose VAP, Virtual Analog Polysynth, though all the previous synths could be played polyphonically as well if you want. And let's maybe go into an init patch first and see what this one's about. So here too, just to hear what's going on, I'm going to open up the filter, close down the resonance, and add sustain. You've got 2 oscillators with a mix control between them. Virtual analog style shapes for each. You can choose pulse width for each if you want, and turn oscillator sync. I think that's just for oscillator 2. And the important part here is that you can tune each of the oscillators separately in semitone intervals. There's a noise option, fine tune, and I think this one has quite a few other filter models. Yeah, quite a few to choose from. High pass, band pass, notch filters. I won't go through all of these. This, for example, is the bandpass filter. So VAP is probably the most powerful but menu diving rich synth engine here. This one's also more complex in terms of modulation. So you've got 3 envelopes, 2 LFOs, and a mod matrix. So in addition to the macro controls, you've got a, I think, 6-slot matrix in here with a choice of mod sources for each slot, 3 envelopes, 2 LFOs, and multiple destinations within the synth that you can modulate. So 6 of these slots, portamento again, and at the end, the macros. Let's maybe play the preset lottery here just a bit. So you can hear those intervals, the noise. All these, by the way, I'm playing without reverb, so will obviously sound better if I had reverb, but let's not. So those are a few of the VAP patches. Let's move on to the last one, WTFM. So let's dive in and edit this patch. Okay, so we start out with a sine wave. And in FM, you've got a modulator and a carrier, and the FM depth is how you get those cool FM tones. And you can, of course, modulate FM. You've got ratio control, both for the carrier and for the modulator. Then let's maybe turn down FM for a bit. You've got shape control for both, which is a nice touch for an FM synth. Certainly for a 2-operator one, this gives you much more timbral control. Then you've got feedback for both oscillators, and I guess a cross feedback option. Fine-tune, which is important for FM. Oversampling, which changes the character of the sound, and character, which changes the character of the sound quite a bit. So pretty powerful synth here for FM. Then a filter on top of that, which is also nice, and the same parameters we're used to seeing from VAP, envelopes, LFOs, and a mod matrix here too, again with 6 slots, sources, and destinations, as well as, of course, macros in the end. So pretty cool. Let's take a listen to a few of the presets. So start here. So timbres you'd expect to hear from FM synths, and a few you don't. I think a pretty respectable offering. Okay, so those are the synth engines. Before we head out to the pros and cons, I wanted to cover a few features that were added since my initial video, many of which are relevant to the new synth engines too. First, the fill feature has been expanded to include not just beats or kicks or snares, but also chords and bass, or chords alone and bass alone. So let's just go for the whole set, chords and bass. Now, before you activate this, you need to go into the settings and choose which synths you want to occupy, the bass channel and the synth channel. And you can also actually use synths for the kicks and the beats if you want. Anyway, so fills work by first selecting either 4 chord tracks, a single bass track, or 5 tracks for everything, and then just hit the fill button and hope for the best. And I can choose a longer pattern too. That works nicely as well. And different styles, of course. So this is a nice way to get ideas going. One important thing to note here, one of the cool features of fill when you're using it in sample mode, is that it'll randomize the samples based on the categorized samples you have in your project. Play, at least as of the current firmware, only lets you load 1 patch per device. So there are no patch pools or anything like that. So regardless of how many times you press fill, you'll always hear the same sound. Hopefully they'll add patch pools or synth patch pools later on. Then another cool feature that was added since my video is the long press on view to open up a piano roll style control where you can scroll up and down and add or remove notes. So that's a welcome feature. The notes you can enter here adjust, by the way, based on the scale of the project. Another important feature that was added is stem export. This works nicely with the synth slots too, so you get 3 stereo tracks for each of the 3 synth timbres, and there are quite a few other features, but I think noteworthy ones are the option to delete unused samples. This way, if you load a pack that's a bit too big, you can use the samples you like and then delete the ones you don't. And a few other features were added, but I think the final noteworthy one is the fact that the reverb and delay can now be customized. So you've still got all the presets, which I think are pretty nice, but if you want to get hands-on, then you can with any of these. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Play and for Play Plus. On the pros side, you now have 2 options. The sample-only regular Play has been heavily discounted. It's still an original instrument with a fresh look at what a Groovebox can do. Well worth a look, I think, especially at its now new, relatively affordable price. It's not perfect, but it's different in a good way, and its generative and performance features are something that break the mold and are a fun way to make music fast. And then on top of that, you now have the option, at additional cost of course, to get a version that also has multiple synth engines that I think sound great. And given the fact that you can play 3 timbres at a time, and the fact that you've got 8 new voices in addition to the 8 sample voices, all that can add substantial depth and variety to the music you can make here. So what are the cons, in my opinion, for Play Plus, and is it worth the upgrade from the original Play? I like to split these 2 cons on the hardware side, meaning things that likely can't change, and then firmware wishlist features, which we might get in future firmware updates. Starting on the hardware side, it's an inconvenience that the synth features aren't labeled on the panel. If you make this your main instrument, then you'll quickly remember what's where, but if you're just a casual user or have this as part of a larger setup, then not having synth-relevant labels add an extra bit of cognitive load every time you get back to this. Beside that, even if the panel was labeled, you only have direct control over 6 synth macros, 7 if you count velocity. Everything else is something you'll need to menu dive for in the patch editor. The good news is that there are plenty of excellent, in my opinion, factory presets, over 200 in total as of the making of this video. But if you're someone who likes to edit their own presets, you'll need to make do with this list and going through parameters like I am now. Then another thing you need to be aware of on the hardware side is that the synth tracks are now shared with any MIDI tracks you want to use. So if you were envisioning using Play Plus as the brain for a larger synth setup, you'll be able to control fewer external MIDI instruments if you also want to use the internal synths at the same time. So for example, here I've got chords taking up 4 tracks and then another track for the bass. That leaves only 3 tracks for controlling external MIDI devices. You could compress this a bit if you use the chord function, which is available for synth tracks as well as MIDI tracks, but still synth and MIDI control is shared across this grid. Finally, on the hardware side, totally unrelated to synths, sample memory is fairly limited at 6 minutes mono or 3 minutes for stereo audio. You'll feel this particularly if you want to program multiple songs into a single project. That leads me to something which I don't know if it's a firmware issue or a hardware limitation. Right now you get only 1 patch per synth timbre per project. So if you're familiar with Play, you've got multiple variations per pattern and then multiple patterns per project. All of these, at least currently, need to share the same 3 patches. So you can't use different patches, say, for the chorus or verse, certainly not for different songs or different patterns. You're stuck with the 1 patch per synth engine per project. That also means that a lot of the fun generative features of Play that work on the sample side of Play Plus won't work on the synth side. Patch randomization with fill or with chance or randomize. Since you've only got 1 patch per synth, all that doesn't work. I think a lot of these generative features based on samples in folders are what make Play special. Then another thing that at least currently doesn't work is perform mode when you're in synth mode. So you can move into sample mode and then perform mode will appear, and this is an awesome part of Play. So this still works with samples, but all of these, except the looping column, won't work with synths. So looping, this stutter-like effect, works, which is nice, but yeah, all these other ones won't do anything to the synth voices, at least not currently. Now I asked Polyend about this and they said they were going to add perform mode to the synth and MIDI tracks, but I have to admit that's what they told me also in my original view of Play. They sound more serious this time, but if perform mode is important for you, then you might want to wait until that update actually comes out. A few more miscellaneous items. Right now, if you edit the synth patches and then forget to save the changes or save as a new patch if you don't want to overwrite the factory presets, then once you go and save the project, those patches won't be saved. All the macro programming and sequencing is, but not changes to the actual patches themselves. I think they should change that, and I believe they said they will. One more feature on my wish list: once a note is triggered, you can no longer control it with the macros until the next note is triggered. And I think there should be a way to do that, so that you can change the timbre of notes as they play. Now you can motion sequence no notes, so you can program in a timbral change over time just by dropping these notes in, but I think that's a bit tedious. Then a few other first world problems. I'd love to see access to the SD card over USB. I think it would be great to also have MIDI control over the patch parameters, the synth patch parameters. So if you did want to get a MIDI controller to control these in real time, it would be nice to be able to do that. It would be nice to have a drive feature for the synths, even if it's in a menu here. And then since we now have 16 tracks, 8 synth, 8 samples, I think a central mixer would be nice as well, so that you can easily manage gain and balance the 16 tracks. And beside that, I did encounter a few bugs while I was testing this admittedly pre-launch firmware. Polyend do have a good track record of issuing firmware updates and fixing bugs, but if you're sensitive to glitches here and there, you might want to wait a couple of firmware updates. So that's it for Play Plus. I'll upload high quality samples of some of its audio on my Patreon, where you'll also find my ever expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.